Stephen Jones visited Rogers Museum in Southwark Street, drawn by its eerie reputation. He was surprised to find the waxen exhibits more terrifying than those at Madame Tussaud's. The creator, George Rogers, was a former Tussaud staff member who had been discharged due to his sanity and secret worship practices. Rogers' hobbies were teratology and iconography of nightmare, and he had created a special alcove for adults only, featuring hybrid creatures, mythological monsters, and other terrifying forms. Jones met Rogers in his dingy office and workroom, where waxen body parts and costumes were scattered. He noticed a large melting furnace and a door with a peculiar symbol, which he recognized from the dreaded Necronomicon. Rogers' conversation was intense and hinted at dark faiths and practices. As Jones visited more often, Rogers shared wild stories of mysterious trips and reading forbidden books. One night, after drinking whiskey, Rogers boasted of finding evidence of strange survivals in nature, connected to other dimensions and worlds. Jones was skeptical, but Rogers implied that some of the nightmare creatures in the alcove were not artificial. Their cordiality ended as Jones continued to visit, fascinated by Rogers' madness. The tension peaked in September when Jones heard a peculiar sound from Rogers' workroom. Jones visited the museum, where he heard a strange, anguished yelp, like a dog's scream. The dark, foreign-looking attendant, Orabona, told him it came from outside, but Jones was suspicious. He explored the neighborhood, finding a dim courtyard behind the museum, but no dog. He peeked through the basement windows, seeing a glow of light near a mysterious, padlocked door. Jones returned to the museum, meeting Rogers, who was in an unusual mood, boasting about surviving elder gods and nameless sacrifices. Rogers hinted at something big, mentioning a ritual from the 8th Pinacotic fragment and a discovery in Alaska. Jones felt uneasy, noticing Rogers' furtive glances at the padlocked door and a burlap-covered object on the floor. Rogers and Orabona explored ancient ruins, finding an ivory throne and a mysterious entity that needed sacrifice to survive. They brought it to London, hiding it in a box, and told the Americans who helped them that it was an archaeological find. Rogers showed Jones, a skeptic, photographs of their journey, including a bizarre interior chamber with wild carvings and a throne. He revealed that the entity was a god and needed human or animal blood to come alive. Orabona was against waking it, fearing its power. Rogers performed rites and sacrifices, and eventually the entity came to life. Jones was horrified when Rogers showed him the remains of a dog, tortured and drained of blood, which he claimed was a sacrifice to the entity. Rogers then showed Jones a photograph of the entity, a monstrous, cyclopean creature with 6 limbs, crab-like claws, and a bulbous head with fishy eyes and a proboscis. In a dimly lit room, Jones examined a terrifying creature created by Rogers, a sculptor with a twisted mind. The creature had dark, slender tentacles and bulging fish eyes, exuding hate, greed, and cruelty. Rogers believed it was a god and he was its priest. Jones tried to reason with Rogers, telling him it was just a creation, but Rogers was convinced of its power. Jones decided to spend the night in the dark exhibition room to prove that the creature was just an effigy, and Rogers agreed to take a new view of things if Jones succeeded. As they left for dinner, Rogers took a gruesome burden wrapped in burlap and dropped it down a manhole in the courtyard. Jones shuddered, feeling uneasy around Rogers. They agreed to meet at the museum at 11 p.m., and Jones spent the evening dining and preparing for the vigil. When they met, Rogers locked Jones in the exhibition room, and Jones began his long, tedious wait in the dark. Jones was alone in the dark, vaulted museum chamber, feeling like he was in a tomb. The stillness was complete, and he wished he could hear something, anything, to break the silence. He shuffled his feet, but the echoes seemed to mock him. His senses were heightened, and he thought he could hear faint sounds that might be coming from another dimension. The floating specks of light in his eyes seemed to be moving with a purpose, and he felt a sense of unease. The air was chilly and tasted salty, like the brine of dark subterranean waters. He could smell something musty, like specimens in a natural history museum. Jones knew he had to guard against his imagination, but it was hard not to think about the strange claims Rogers had made about his wax figures. He wondered if Rogers had really been to Alaska, and if the insane picture he had shown him was real. The proximity of the waxen shapes began to unnerve Jones, and he started to imagine they were moving. He tried to shut his eyes, but the images only got worse. He saw the guillotine creaking, and the bearded face of Landru twisting into monstrous menace. He heard a bubbling sound coming from Madame Demer's severed throat, and the headless, legless victim of a trunk murder trying to edge closer. Jones tried to focus on the hideous images to distract himself from the even more terrifying ones that lurked in the shadows. He saw Black Tsathagua and a lean, rubbery night gaunt, and he knew he was reverting to his childhood fears. He used his adult reason to keep the phantoms at bay, but it was hard. When he flashed his light again, he saw that the images were still there, but they were not as bad as what his imagination had conjured up. However, he suspected that the canvas partition screening off the adults-only alcove was trembling, and he knew what lay beyond. He saw the form of fabulous Yog-Sothoth and the sharp horn of Nofke, the hairy myth-thing of the Greenland ice. Jones walked boldly toward the alcove, but his fears were still there. He knew they were not true, but he could not shake them off. He returned to his seat, shut his eyes, and let the symmetrical light specks do their worst. The distant clock boomed a single stroke, and Jones knew he had. In a workroom, Jones was terrified by a mysterious presence. He heard footsteps and a shuffling sound, and when he turned on his flashlight, he saw a monstrous creature unlike any animal. But as it began to chant in a human voice, Jones realized it was actually Rogers, a madman, dressed in a disguise. Rogers was trying to sacrifice Jones to a devil god, Rantegoth. Jones broke free and fought back, eventually overpowering Rogers and binding him. As Jones prepared to leave and call for help, Rogers regained consciousness and hurled curses at him, warning him that Rantegoth would seek vengeance. In a dimly lit warehouse, Jones confronted the sinister showman, Rogers, who had a dark obsession with creating wax effigies. Rogers boasted about his art, claiming he could preserve and immortalize anyone, including Jones. He revealed that he had obtained a mysterious, otherworldly creature from Yuggoth, which he kept hidden behind a padlocked door. The creature, Rantegoth, required blood to survive, and Rogers planned to use Orabona as its next victim. As Jones listened in horror, Rogers began to chant and call out to the creature, which seemed to respond. The air was filled with an eerie, unhuman screaming, and Jones felt an intense sense of dread. Suddenly, Rogers stopped screaming and listened intently, claiming that the creature was coming. Jones heard strange noises, like splashing and padding, and a noxious animal stench wafted from the cracks in the door. Rogers cackled with glee, urging Jones to release him so they could pay homage to the creature. But Jones was paralyzed with fear, his imagination running wild with hallucinations. He heard the creature fumbling with the latch, pounding on the door, and eventually breaking through. As the door splintered, a black paw with a crab-like claw emerged, and Jones's fear turned into frenzied automatic flight. Jones experienced a terrifying night at the museum, where he seemingly leaped across a crypt, ran out of the building, and raced through the streets of Southwark. He didn't remember how he got home and kept his experience a secret. A week later, he was allowed to leave his bed and walk outside. Jones scanned newspapers but found no mention of anything strange at the museum. He wondered what was real and what was a morbid dream. 2 weeks later, Jones returned to the museum, where he met Orabona, who was in charge in Rogers' absence. Orabona told Jones that Rogers had gone to America on business, and that he had found the workroom in disarray on the day after Jones' last visit. A new specimen, the sacrifice to Rantegoth, was on display, but the police deemed it too morbid and ordered its removal. Orabona offered Jones a private view, which filled him with unease and repulsion. The specimen was a colossal, shapeless god with a victim, and Jones recognized the victim's face as resembling Rogers. Jones was horrified and fascinated by the exhibit, wondering what drove Rogers to create such a masterpiece. Jones examined the wax face, noticing the skillful handling of the punctures, which resembled the wounds on a poor dog. However, he found an irregularity on the left cheek that seemed out of place. As he gazed at it, he felt growing horror. Suddenly, he recalled a terrifying night when Rogers, a madman, was restrained, and a long scratch was left on his left cheek. This memory sent Jones into a faint. Meanwhile, Orabona maintained a smile.